Here we're going to run through an example of the innovation disclosure form that I filled out for one of my recent inventions. Now don't copy this. This is totally confidential. I put together this innovation disclosure form this morning, and I want to give you an example of how I would do this. Interestingly, I actually found myself jumping way ahead because I'm used to going through the process a lot more quickly. So I had to dial it back, and I'll tell you a little bit about how that happened. But first, let's run through the disclosure form briefly, and then I'll give you a few more details about my process. So you can see here, I've just added the date. I did this morning when I got up, and I added my name because I'm the only person who contributed to this invention. And then I added a very simple title called the Hinged Tool Stand. I'll show you what that is in just a minute. For the brief description, all I did was take a couple minutes and just start writing quickly down exactly what I think I'm doing. I've included things like what my invention is at a very high level and how it's used and what some of the very basic pieces are in the invention. And maybe these are the functions it would provide and any quick alternatives. So this doesn't need to be very long. It just needs to give somebody the general idea as to what you're doing. Frankly, I probably wrote more here than I would expect to see from most inventors, simply because, again, I've done this process many times and I was probably getting ahead of myself a little bit. If you have 2 or 3 or 4 sentences here and it gives the introduction, I think that's enough. Don't worry about trying to fill in the additional information at this point in this section. After the brief description, I've gone ahead and I've put in a photograph that I took. This is simply a prototype, essentially, that I built, and I installed it in my shed, and it gives you, I think, a good idea of what's going on here, but we're going to describe it in more detail below. So I've got my detailed description here that goes into a little bit more detail. And what I did, instead of going into a lot of written detail, was, as I showed you before, I put a photo in that I took, and then I put in a little bit of description around what's in the photo. As you can see, if I were to just describe it in words now looking at the picture, it's a couple pieces of wood with holes drilled in them of different sizes. Those pieces of wood are attached to a back brace board that has hinges on it, so these panels can hinge up and down, and when you put a rake or shovel or another tool inside those holes, and then you let the panel just drop down naturally with the hinge, it binds and mechanically holds the tool upright in the same position. And at the same time that it holds the tool upright, it's holding the panel at an angled position, binding against the tool. So the actual angle just depends on the dimensions of the tool and the dimensions of the hole. And it just sits there. And if you look back at the picture over on the right, you can see that one of the panels is not being used with tools right now, and so it just folds right down. This is really one of the advantages. This is a space-saving advantage, so that you don't have to have a dedicated wall space that's only exclusively for tools. If you're not using the tools, then the floor space and the wall space don't need to be set up and occupied by a tool rack. So then in the detailed description here, I just talk about how I built it. I used a piece of wood about this size and about this length, and I put hinges on it, and I drilled holes here and there, and here are the sizes, and here are the number of holes. Really, it's just describing what the invention is as I've come up with it, and as I photographed it out in my shed. The next section is the background section, where I go into a little bit more background about the problem that I'm addressing. I've added a little bit of alternative embodiments in there as well. This will be helpful as you start thinking about how you can broaden your invention. Ultimately, you'll anticipate what a competitor might try to do in order to copy your invention or avoid infringing your invention. And then you'll turn that around and say, well, why don't I just include that in my patent application to begin with and prevent them from copying me on that aspect in the future? You can see the competitive implementations here below. So this is really it for the innovation disclosure form. This is how I would do it, minus maybe some of the additional details that I tried to put in there initially because I got carried away. If you put together something similar to this, by the time you're done with your innovation disclosure form, you'd be ready to file your first version of a provisional patent application. Now, we can make it a lot better by going into more detail in the steps that we've done already and breaking them out and going through a lot more instruction. But that's not the point of this module. Here we're just trying to give everyone a very brief introduction as to how somebody might file a provisional patent application on their own time with very little commitment and very little money in the process. And if we want to take this innovation disclosure form and file it as its own provisional patent application now, I could do that. And once I file it, I would have patent pending status. So if I were headed to a trade show tomorrow, which might be a really bad idea if I don't have a prototype I could take with me already, but if I were headed to a show or headed to a customer meeting or something like that, I could file this document today. Then I could go to my meeting and confidently tell them, yes, this is a patent pending invention. It's pretty quick, it's pretty easy, and it's the right starting point for you if you need to get something filed quickly.